Why did Richard III kill his nephews in the Tower? The Mystery of the Princes in the Tower, London, summer of 1483. Two young princes, heirs to the mighty House of York, vanish without a trace within the cold stone walls of the Tower of London. Their uncle, Richard of Gloucester, a man forged in the fires of battle, now sits on the throne as King Richard III. But how did a loyal brother and a fierce warrior become the most hated villain in English history? Why did Richard betray the blood of his own family? And what dark secrets lie buried beneath the tower that still haunt England to this day? Was it ambition that drove Richard to commit one of the most chilling crimes in royal history? Or was he simply a puppet in a game of deadly politics, played by forces far more cunning than himself? From the brutal arrest at Stony Stratford to the coronation that never happened, and from Elizabeth Woodville's plot for vengeance to the final battle at Bosworth Field, this is the untold, blood-soaked story of betrayal, murder, and the fall of the House of York. But here's the real question. What happened to the two princes after they disappeared? Were they smothered in their sleep? Buried beneath the tower's staircase? Or did they survive? Prepare yourself for the darkest royal conspiracy in English history, a tale of power, blood, and ghosts that refuse to be silenced. If you want the truth that history tried to bury, stay with us to the end. Follow us, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to uncover more chilling mysteries from history's darkest pages. The year was 1471. England's blood-soaked soil groaned beneath the weight of fallen men as the House of York crushed the last of the Lancastrians at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Edward IV of York, tall and golden-haired, sat upon the throne, having secured his rule through sheer force and cunning. Yet, beneath the surface of this fragile peace, shadows gathered. Ambition, greed, and envy festered in the hearts of men. None more so than in Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was not born for courtly games or honeyed words. He was forged on the battlefield, raised among swords and shields, and hardened by the brutality of war. Physically, Richard was described as a man of short stature with a twisted spine, a deformity that the Tudors would later exploit to paint him as a monster. But within that small frame beat the heart of a ruthless tactician, cold and calculating. He had fought beside his brother Edward at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury, spilling blood and crushing skulls for the Yorkist cause. Yet, despite his loyalty in battle, Richard always felt like the shadow of the House of York. While Edward basked in glory and indulgence, Richard brooded in the shadows, quietly sharpening his blade and watching, always watching. When King Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, England shuddered. His heir, Edward V, was a mere boy of 12, a lamb among wolves. And standing at the head of the pack was none other than Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the boy's uncle and newly appointed Lord Protector. But Richard did not crave protection. He craved power. The crown of England gleamed before him, and two little boys stood in his way, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. As young Edward V journeyed from Ludlow Castle to London for his coronation, Richard and his loyal ally, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, intercepted the boy at Stony Stratford. Richard greeted his nephew with smiles and sweet words, masking his true intent beneath a veil of feigned loyalty. Then, like a viper striking from the grass, Richard ordered the arrest of Edward's loyal guardian, Earl Rivers, along with other key supporters of the Woodville family. They were swiftly executed without trial. The boy king was escorted to the Tower of London, supposedly for his protection before the coronation. But the coronation never came. Richard, like a master chess player, moved swiftly and ruthlessly. He declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid due to a secret pre-contract. This made Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, illegitimate and unfit to rule. Parliament, spineless and fearful, bowed to Richard's will. On July 6, 1483, Richard of Gloucester was crowned King Richard III of England. But the two princes? They were last seen playing in the tower's gardens, and then they simply vanished. Whispers began to spread through the streets of London. The servants of the tower spoke of strange, muffled cries echoing through the stone walls in the dead of night. Guards swore they saw two small figures, pale and frightened, wandering the corridors like restless spirits. Were they starved, smothered, or quietly strangled in their sleep? One account, recorded decades later by Sir Thomas More, claimed that Richard III ordered his loyal henchman, Sir James Tyrrell, to dispatch the innocents while they slept. Tyrrell supposedly hired two men, John Dighton and Miles Forrest, who crept into the boys' chamber, smothered them with pillows, and buried their bodies beneath the tower's staircase. Elizabeth Woodville, the woman who would become Richard's greatest nightmare. Born to a humble but ambitious family, Elizabeth rose from the shadows of English nobility to marry King Edward IV, the towering Lion of York. She was stunning, intelligent, and politically shrewd, but beneath her grace lay a heart hardened by betrayal and loss. With her husband dead and her sons presumed murdered by Richard, Elizabeth was stripped of her title as queen and forced into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. But Elizabeth was no helpless widow. Driven by grief and fury, she sought vengeance. In a move that shook England's political world, Elizabeth reached out to her old enemy, Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, the last surviving Lancastrian claimant. Imagine it, two women, bound by hatred for Richard and a shared desire to see him fall. For years their relationship had been poisoned by political rivalry and betrayal. Yet, in the face of Richard's tyranny, they forged an unholy alliance. Elizabeth promised her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, in marriage to Henry Tudor, uniting the white rose of York with the red rose of Lancaster. With that promise, Margaret Beaufort sent word to her son, who was in exile in France. "Return, Henry. The throne of England is yours to claim." On a misty August morning, Henry Tudor landed on the shores of England with a ragtag army of French mercenaries and English rebels. Richard III, eager to crush the rebellion, met him on the fields of Bosworth in Leicestershire. But fate, it seemed, had already chosen a victor. In the heat of battle, Richard III, clad in shining armor and wearing a golden crown atop his helmet, saw Henry Tudor from across the field. Fueled by rage and desperation, Richard spurred his horse and charged directly at his enemy, cutting down Tudor's bodyguards with savage precision. Steel clashed. Blood soaked the earth. Yet, as Richard swung his sword toward Henry, the unthinkable happened. His horse stumbled and fell, leaving the king stranded on foot. Surrounded by enemies, Richard screamed his final words, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." But there was no horse, only death. Richard was struck down, his skull shattered by a halberd. His body was stripped of armor and dragged through the mud like a common criminal before being buried in an unmarked grave. With Richard's death, Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII. To solidify his claim to the throne and heal the wounds of the Wars of the Roses, Henry married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. And thus, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were united, bringing an end to nearly 3 decades of bloodshed. But the shadows of Richard's crime refused to be buried. In 1674, over 190 years after the disappearance of the two princes, workmen renovating the Tower of London stumbled upon a wooden chest beneath a staircase. Inside lay 2 small skeletons, huddled together in eternal embrace. King Charles II ordered the bones to be buried in Westminster Abbey, but the truth remained as cold as the stone walls of the tower. Lessons from the shadows of the tower. Greed for power blinds men to humanity. No crime, no matter how well buried, can escape the judgment of history. Justice may be delayed, but it will always come, even if it takes centuries. To this day, visitors to the tower claim to hear soft whispers and faint cries echoing through the ancient halls. Some swear they've seen 2 pale figures, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, holding hands and wandering the corridors, forever seeking justice in death, as they were denied it in life. If you enjoyed this epic tale, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and click the notification button on our channel for more spine-chilling historical stories.